Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to introduce our special guest for this episode. David, is it pronounced Mezzetti?
Mezzetti.
Mezzetti. Yeah, David
Yes, sir.
Mezzetti. And I want to point out that normally the guests are folks that Ravid has been well connected to and Ravid has asked. And I think this is my first guest that is connected to me. And so it's really a pleasure to have you on our episode, and always a pleasure to have the great Ravid Schwartzev on as well. So
I
thank
appreciate it.
Thank you, Alan. Yeah, and congratulations.
so I guess we could get started for David by asking him. I guess the first thing is you're one of the, I would say, early adopters of language models and even word embeddings, right? I think I ran into some of your work circa around 2018, maybe even earlier. Does that sound about right?
It was more like 2019, 2020, but certainly been doing this a little bit longer than some.
And you wrote some early code actually through NewML, and then the main project as part of that. I think it's still a one-man company, just you.
Yes, sir.
TextAI, which got actually quite a number of GitHub stars, especially quite early, like back in that 2019, 2020 timeframe.
Yeah, I mean, it's a project that I started during mostly 2020. Actually stemmed out of there during the coronavirus period where there was literature research going on. And before, we used RAG, I was building an application to do extractive QA with search. And the first types of search I was using were more keyword-based search. And I was looking at I had a couple other projects I had worked on previously that were using vector search, and I started applying that, and that kind of one thing led to another, and then I was able to spin out some of the work I had worked on as part of that project into TextAI.
Yeah. And TextAI, I feel like it's very similar to like the sentence transformers library, and I think even relies on it in certain parts, right? Maybe not very
Yeah.
similar, but it does similar things, right? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Tom from Hugging Face, interact with quite a lot. He's a good guy, and I think he certainly puts in a lot of great features that I use. Certainly for the vector embeddings and the models, I use a lot of, always been a local first AI kind of guy, so the Transformers library has been important to me. But as time has gone on with TextAI, I also support like LightLM and Llama CPP as more and more models move to different. So you can vectorize using OpenAI embeddings if you wanted to, or you could use Transformers models.
I think you're a bit outspoken about your support for local and small models, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm very very big believer. Certainly, when ChatGPT came on to and everyone was moving more towards API based inference for LLMs and vector embeddings. I've always thought about it. Why go and send all your data elsewhere if the embeddings models that you can pull in are just as good, if not better? And in some cases, they're better. So, it's faster, it's local, it's easy. Not everyone is able to send their data remotely for a variety of reasons. So, I do think local first AI is certainly something at least people should take a look at. Be surprised about the number of people who don't even know that's possible. And they just say, oh, you just call this URL and get embeddings back. And that's kind of their worldview of what embeddings are.
But you don't think that, like, at the end, it's very easy, let's say, right? That OpenAI just manage everything, and like you don't need to care about, I don't know, the context and how to manage it over different, I don't know, GPUs, or like when
Sure.
it goes down or up or whatever. You don't think that, like, it's worth a lot that someone else do all the dirty work for you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that, a good baseline general model is good. But I also think that a lot of times that, not every domain is going to work the way you want. And some of the data, well, in a generalized embeddings model, even the local models might work well. I do believe that, having the ability to fine tune a model and customize it to your data is powerful. And I know some of those, APIs do have some ability to do that. And then there's also control over your own model, which just, the vendors will push out different updates and things change. Being able to actually fine tune your model and have it be static is surprisingly powerful, because you can't always guarantee that when, as different models over time are deprecated. And I've read about that with some of the GPT you rely your whole system built on GPT 3.5 or something, and things might change fast in AI world, but maybe not necessarily in that person's production. So I do think that it's an option, and a 20 million parameter model in some cases, like all mini LM, might work good enough for your situation, and you can run it on a CPU. So it's probably not too complicated. I've known people who run those with just a very lightweight, virtual machine or Docker image, and have never really think much more about it.
But do you think? So I had this feeling that I don't know 3, 4 years ago it was quite hard to fine tune models, and like and then you need a lot of expertise, right? Like how
Hmm.
to manage the data, like to pre-process it and all these things, right? And most of the time it doesn't work for in a first shot, and then it become much faster, much better, right? Like the frameworks and all the the pipeline. Do you think we'll see it more and more? I don't know. Easy to train our own models on our own data, or will it kind of saturate it?
I do think there's some level of expertise in terms of building your training data set, but I think more and more being able to train the actual training data itself, whether it or the training scripts itself, are becoming easier and easier. And obviously, in the world of AI generated code, it's never been easier to just ask something to build you a training script. But I do think there's a little bit of an art in training a model that, knowing the right spread of data between, whether it's a text classifier or embeddings model. I do think that, some expertise is beneficial still. I don't know if be interested to see how far we are away from a model knowing that, like, hey, I need to put, uh, this number of classes for this, to classifier, or for an embeddings model, I kind of want this blend of data to work well, and knowing the types of data that's going to throw the model off, and knowing the types of data that is going to help it learn. I still think that it seems to me we're a little bit of ways away from that piece, but anyone could probably train a model and not even be a developer now. I'm sure you could go to a tool and ask it, hey, pull me a data set or pull me something and train me a model.
So, TextAI as a project has gone through, I would say, many, iterations and phases. And I mean, 6 years of development now. Do you have
Yeah.
any like standout features or times in the project history or events that you'd like to share? Kind of.
Yeah, so I mean, I think back to 2020 after I started the first release, it was just, I think I got a lot of traction. I did a Reddit post on the Python subreddit of just, hey, it was a little video of, the idea of semantic search, and every example showed, you know, on left-hand side a query, and then a right-hand side the result with none of the keywords in it. And I think at the time, most people would have been like, all right, well, how do you even map these like that? The biggest one was like, feel good story, and then someone winning the lottery. That was like, kind of stood out, and it was like, it's like comedy mixed in, like a natural, a bear attack related to, wildlife. And it was pretty much saying, "Don't be the slowest guy running away from the bear." So I think I did a pretty good job of creating examples that maybe just got people's attention, but also it did show that, wildlife and, running away from a bear, there was no keyword in there, right? And I think a lot of people that have been in the search space up until that point have realized that, like, hey, this is interesting. Like, how are these things mapping? It's mapping like I would think of it with concepts. So the semantic search piece is still a big core. And even when you go to the TextAI project today, you'll see the first part is how the embeddings database powers all these other things. So from the beginning was always, hey, you need to store your data in some way in order to be able to do everything within TextAI. And then I would say the next kind of jump was working with you with Graph Rag. And I do think that, graphs and being able to, instead of just doing semantic connections, actually trying to build different types of connections of the data was kind of another bump. And then, shortly after that was, ChatGPT was released. And I would say that was about, 2022, 2023. And I spent uh, you know, all of the next year to two on LLMs. I think that was another context switch for TextAI, and I had to put a lot of code in, not just running, to your point about local AI, I think at first, I don't want to say I was stubborn, but I was a little bit stubborn to adopt OpenAI's API and using API services. And I do think that, it was a little bit to my detriment, to be honest, because I do think that a project like LangChain was like, I'm just going to use OpenAI, and it got more traction at that time. So I kind of realized that probably wasn't, a smart move, because to Rev's earlier point, like running LLMs are even harder, right? So if there's someone who's going to make it easy to run, and I'm saying, no, you must do it the hard way, it's probably not like necessarily the biggest, it's not the smartest thing to do in order to get people to use your framework, right? So I did look at, over time, I evolved to say, all right, well, LLM APIs, there's going to be people who want to use them, OpenAI, Claude, whatever. It's just easy. You call web APIs. There in like 23, 24, I evolved to, I don't care how you load your LLM. It could be Llama CP, it could be, an API. And then that kind of brought me to more of the, RAG LMs and things like that, but all built by that foundation of the embeddings database vectors. More recently, it's been big fan. I have a big interest in small models and tiny models, because um, I've I was a computer engineering major, so I think that I always have that piece from the electrical engineering background of just a very big interest in trying to do things in a very small microcontroller way. So I think that that's always stuck with me. I've always had an affinity for assembly programming, for whatever. So yeah, if you ever look at a lot of my examples, why is this guy always putting in, even I put in an example recently into TextAI for code generation. And of course it was in assembly. I always kind of sneak it in, because I do find, just low level programming and doing things at like high performance, on limited resources, an interesting problem area.
And related to that, you mentioned earlier LangChain, and LangChain absolutely captured lightning in a bottle by being the very first kind of trimmings around an LLM library, adding in, vector search, document parsing, and a whole lot else. But early LangChain, at least, and maybe, I don't know if the reputation is still there today, because I don't really use LangChain that much anymore. I've mostly switched to LlamaIndex or other tools. But LangChain has a terrible reputation around the time that it first came out for being very low code quality. And I will say one of the reasons that I used NewML and TextAI is I believe the code quality, the documentation, and everything around it, the design is very high quality, and written by one person who's very passionate rather than hundreds like LangChain. So do you think that maybe, especially going forward now with like Claude Code vibe coding most of its own features, do you think that there's going to be an advantage to that, this approach you have of putting in a lot of human intentionality, kind of always being like local model first, small models
Sure.
first?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of, LangChain, LlamaIndex, TextAI, Haystack tend to be like the top 4 frameworks for the quote unquote LLM/AI orchestration space. I think they all have their pros and cons. I try not to talk bad about anything else, because I don't really understand. One thing I learned, I've been around a little bit. One thing I've always learned is that, there's always a reason to how someone built something, right? Whether, one person could think something doesn't work well, but I think LangChain did a great job of, like you said, capturing lightning in a bottle. And a lot of people are using your library, and that leads you to having to make changes fast. You get PRs, you got all sorts of things coming in. So I understand how that could get hard to manage over time. I mean, I've been fortunate that I've been able to keep up with TextAI as a one-person company, but it does give me a little bit of advantage that I could kind of think about what I want the next features to be. And I've had plenty of PRs and contributors, but it's always been mostly me doing that. But I've created a lot of examples. I think that is a big thing. I've created a lot of examples, and I have a lot of documentation, which to your one, and it's funny you bring this up, because recently I thought about this. I was like, just like I was a little bit stubborn on, uh, LM APIs, I've probably been a little bit stubborn on quote unquote vibe coding. And I've kind of come around on that a little bit more lately myself. And I mean, I'm not to the point where I'm just going to not code anymore, but I think I've been more open-minded to it. And it's led me to realize that, what, all the work I've done with TextAI, it's actually quite well positioned if someone wants to build code because it's well documented, there's a lot of reference examples. If you went into Cloud Code, Open Code, and you say, hey, build me a TextAI example doing this, that, or the other, which I've recently demonstrated, it does a pretty good job. And it doesn't have to be that smart. All it has to do is run a web search, and there's plenty of stuff for it to pick from. That I think that's an advantage.
But so I have a question. Like there was this, I think Cursor tried to re-implement Google Home or something like that in a week, and they did quite a good job, right, using Cursor and thousands of agents, whatever. So do you think so? There is one level, right, to let your LLM to just to write a code based on your framework. But what if I actually can re-implement your framework? Like, do you think it is something that we will see more and more, or like that framework is some, I don't know, something very basic that like we need to must keep going and maintaining it,
Yeah.
and someone needs to do the hard
Yeah.
work.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's an interesting point because I've thought about that myself. I'm like, hey, as we do more and more development, is there even a need for frameworks? Forget about generating a framework. Why even bother, right? If you just have something that generates a custom, a set of classes or custom scripts that just to do what you want. Let's pick RAG. It's a pretty relatively simple concept at the surface. You don't really need a framework to do that. There's obviously all sorts of different variations of RAG, which are more complicated. But I do think that it's a valid point, in the surface. But I think also one thing I've learned about LLMs over time is that the more complicated you get, the less accuracy you get. So if you ask it to build you a TextAI RAG example, it can do a pretty good job. But then once you go down to saying, just build me a RAG example or something more complicated that the framework abstracts from the LLM, I think then you're asking it to do more. The more complexity you introduce, the less likely the successful answer is going to come into, at least with current day LLMs. Hey, who knows? Maybe with when we all move away from the transformers architecture and that new advancement comes in that at some point everyone thinks is going to happen. Maybe a point comes, but I also always look back to people for a long time said that flying cars would happen, and or self-driving cars even. And I know in San Francisco it is more of a thing, but in the rest of the country, I don't see any cars driving around, not in my streets. So I do think that people think things are right around the corner, but then there's just a lot of complexity that makes it hard. So I do think that for a while that I would say even with something like vibe coding or AI coding, that using, hey, generate me a process using a more complex framework and abstracting that from the LLM is still likely to lead to better results.
So I have this kind of belief that in certain parts in society or in life that we actually go backwards once in a while, and they're kind of random examples. Like for example, we don't use central vacuums as much as we used to in like the 70s or 80s. And I'm wondering, I always feel like with NewML and TextAI that a little bit it feels like we moved away from all these things that people should be caring about. Like you talked about extractive QA, right? And indeed, the paper we wrote together around using knowledge graphs for constructing competitive debate cases relies on extractive QA and a graph RAG kind of approach of well, not RAG, it's not generating, right? With graph
Right.
retrieval using a path, like a path in the embedding space. I realized actually forms pretty reliably a pretty decent debate case in a sense of going from one portion of the argument to the next and kind of drawing it coherently. So I'm wondering, how, like, do you feel that the field has like way over indexed on generative methods to the yeah.
That's a question I've asked myself. Certainly, like I look to when I came out with the graph piece for TextAI, that was like September 2022. I think about, the fork in the road. Let's just say ChatGPT never came out. What would 2026 look like today? Let's just say it was delayed, or let's even say there was no generative AI. I do think there was a lot of things that paused and a bunch of people like ourselves went in a different direction. So whatever research we were working on, whatever projects we were working on, our interests kind of got push towards generative AI. And you think about RAG, and you think about how you're asking an LLM to effectively do span detection. You want it to do what extractive QA was doing, but you're doing it in a very complex way. You're like, all right, I want you to read this, and I want pretty much you to pull out the snippet, but I want you to do it in a way that's really hard. I want you to read it and then generate the tokens. When, extraction QA is set up to do that. A lot of what people want out of RAG is pretty much just going to their document and pulling out the information. They don't want you to, that's where hallucinations came in. They don't want you to make it up. There is summarization, obviously reframing, rephrasing, but if you look at the vast majority of what people want is they want to go to their documents and like cut and paste the information they're interested in and put it into something else. And, in a way, wouldn't you say that generative AI is a really complicated way to do that? You're having it input all the tokens, process it, and then hope your guesses to push out the right ones.
I just will say, because like we have 10% of our time should be spent on JEPA. Do you know what is JEPA? So JEPA is like, we talked about it a lot on the podcast. It's like kind of like a joint embedding prediction models. Basically, the idea is that you separate between the embedding and the generation.
Okay.
So, and I think this is this is one of the best reason to actually use kind of like JEPA style models, because there are a lot of tasks, right, that you don't want or like you don't need generation. And if you can't separate between them, and you can separate and you can measure it, and you can't optimize over non-generative tasks, it will be much harder to make good models. So yeah. Anyway, but I have another question. Like, do you think it's, for example, all the framework, like there is now how it's called, terminal bench or something like that. The idea is that everything that you can verify, you can optimize over it. Okay, so if you have like a test for it, you can optimize. So kind of like how people are doing RL these days, right? Like you're taking GitHub issues, and you're taking like a test from these GitHub repositories, and you're training your model with RL to solve these tasks. And as long as you have a verified a way to verify your solution, right, in code, it's easy. You can run it. You're good, and there is no like way that you can fail. So what do you think? Do you think like we will see more and more task or method like that? Do you believe that this is something that, like, if we can verify it, will success? Or like there are some tasks that maybe it's more, I don't know, with RAG, for example, and extraction, maybe more difficult and more complicated, and this is why we actually don't see a good enough solutions till now?
I mean, I think that pushing on the human, at least to say, what do you want and what's the answer? And then, I think machines and models are better and better at being able to actually, build to validate things. So I do think I could see more and more of that style of, but I just still think, I think where you're going is, how much human intervention are we looking at for development and building these things, or how much could it be automated, and how much is it is just really hard and complicated? So I still think, personally, to think we're a little bit of ways away from full on, that type of structure. I do think that, there's more and more that, I mean, I sort of like you, every time you think maybe it's not as far along, you see something like, all right, maybe it is far along, then it isn't. There's pieces of it, but I don't know if I see 100% going in that direction right now.
So, the TextAI, you were talking about how you kind of resisted for a little bit integrating OpenAI API compatibility. It seems right now that in 2026, we're having a movement where everybody's like, oh my gosh, Anthropic has their own API spec, and we need to support that as well. So is that something you've already added or will add soon? And do you expect all these other frameworks and libraries to kind of do the same thing? And furthermore, OpenAI API spec has been a monopoly, right? VLLM, SGLang, and everybody else kind of follows it. Do you think now with Anthropic giving us a new API spec that the field will become more fragmented, or it's going to be very common to swap between the two when you
Yeah.
like an inference server?
Yeah. I mean, I for TextAI, I use light LLM, so I do think that I've somewhat abstracted that decision to another library. You know, if light LLM were to support, which I know they support all sorts of different APIs, not just OpenAI's API. So for a long time, I've always kind of, but yeah, you look at Llama. I mean, pretty much almost all of these, VLM, all of these services have just pretty much said, hey, we can act like the OpenAI a library, and you just got to change your base URL to whatever new URL, and you're good to go, right? So I do think that having the message, you provide the messages in the same format, and all of these libraries are built on building system messages and user messages and in kind of a certain format. But if I think that Claude has gotten quite popular and quite influential, so I do think people will be forced to have to, if they choose to want to do something their own way. And I don't know if it's just not invented here syndrome, or if there's some really good advantages to different formats for providing information. But you do wonder if it would get fragmented. I would, be concerned. But for a library like TextAI, I've long, I don't like to reinvent the wheel, so I won't. I don't have a bunch of code in TextAI that's connected into all of these different. I've went to Light LLM and said, hey, these guys have kind of seemed like they want to be in the space for abstracting inference with LLM. So I've long used that, and it's just an API they have. So the hope would be for someone like myself, what's in TextAI world, that would be just abstracted in an upstream library.
And forgive me if this question is prying too much.
Yeah.
No problem if you want to skip
No.
it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I remember at the time that I was working with you that you were quite lucratively, like you had lucrative contracts related to helping, I think it was hospitals with embedding documents. Is NewML and TextAI still clearly paying the bills?
Yeah. So I mean, it's been consulting, and so it wasn't hospitals, but it was in the medical space, companies that are, you know, specialized in looking to look at medical literature, and that's been a big, piece of work. And I've been fortunate that most of the companies that have chosen to work with me have been more long term. But there's been a few that like, hey, we want to work with you on a, more smaller basis for, just for a couple hours. In terms of generating, it generates enough for me to keep doing it. So you could make the argument that it could do, certainly could generate more than I am, but I also think, and I write, actually, it's funny you ask that, because if you look at my Medium page, I'm quite open about how every year I publish a year in review for NewML, and it pretty much puts it all out there of like, hey, my goal is to do this, and I either did this or didn't. And one of it is talking about the consultant. I don't name who I work with, but I talk about, hey, this is where I'm trying to be. And, the goal has always been at least to be, within the margin of error of a job for someone like myself, which I think I've obtained. You can make the argument that NewML is a company, certainly, and I've talked to companies for investment along the way. People, especially early on when I was new, people were poking around saying, "Hey, what are you thinking? What do you want to do with this thing? Do you want backend? Do you want a company to, you know, invest in you?" And I've even had, and I'll be open, I've had people reach out to me and say, "Hey, could we quote unquote buy NewML?" And that would be what that really would mean. Is just it'd be the ultimate acqui-hire, right? Hey, we want to be able to bring you in to work with us. We know it's just you, and you don't think you're going on vacation and going to buy a yacht. We're buying this so you come work with us, just to make that clear. So I understand. I mean, obviously, TextAI itself has some value, but it has value as long as I'm with it. I understand that they're intricately connected. But I've long liked. I mean, I think I've been able to build a sustainable situation right now. I think that with the advancement of being, am I a 100x engineer? Maybe. I mean, I think people talk about that with the tools of AI. Now you're a 100x engineers. I don't really look at it that way, though. I've been able to be pretty efficient, but I do, for people who look out there about, if you go to that Medium article, if you new ML year in review, you'll see everything. And I do think that there's always room for improvement and being able to work with more. And it's always a constant struggle. If you're one person, how much time do you spend on TextAI and open source? I mean, you need uh, people to use it in order to set you in the right direction. I could just kind of keep developing features, right? And you hope you're guessing and shooting at the right target. But every project I've had has always pushed me in a good direction. So I do think that blend, and it's just a matter of what that blend is. And the more consulting I do, the less I work on TextAI. So if you ever see TextAI in a little bit of a drought, it doesn't mean I'm not on vacation. I'm probably just working on, probably doing a consulting project.
So why you are doing TextAI?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think before NewML, I had a company I built and actually went through an acquisition and grew it to 50 people, and it was all IT contracting. So it was very similar. Like, imagine 50 of me. So it was a company of 50 of me where we all worked on projects, and it was a great company. And I happened to be one of the founders, so I spent a lot of time on at first being me, and then as time went on, I became less and less technical and more operational as running the company. And I had luckily fortunate to build something of value, and it would go through an acquisition. That piece of the story I think is a little important, because you kind of think, why in 2020 did you all of a sudden just decide to do this? And I think I had this opportunity where I was able to actually take a step back, and it was a full-on sale, and a lot of people stayed at the company, but I was one of the people who said, hey, I'm going to go in a different direction. So I didn't have to stay. There was no like, hey, you have to work at the new company kind of stuff. So 2020 happened. I had some ideas of things I wanted to work on. I actually really like sports, and I had some ideas in sports, and this was like February 2020, and then coronavirus happened, and there was no sports anymore. So I'm like, all right, well, that's probably not a good idea. And I don't think, honestly, I don't really know if any of the ideas I had were anything useful. It was probably did me a favor. In some ways, coronavirus probably did me a favor by not pushing me to spend too much time on those ideas. I don't know if they would have really led anywhere, but I do think that that gave me the opportunity. And I never really imagined getting into medical literature. It's just that coronavirus, and there was all those Kaggle challenges that I started participating in, and I did pretty well. And then that got published. It was like a Wall Street Journal article about, citizen scientists working on coronavirus. And I think that all those things kind of came to a confluence where I was able to take those ideas out, and I said, hey, this is pretty good. And then, hey, I think it could be wrote into a framework. So, I mean, that was originally why TextAI, why I even thought about building it. It wasn't like I just sat down and said, hey, I want to build TextAI. It was more of a, that series of events just led to that. I don't know about you guys, but I feel like a lot of things in my life are just, you kind of go on a path, and then things are presented to you, and you either just choose to take advantage of them or not, right?
I have to observe that you're not the only library that was inspired through medical, or a desire to help in healthcare. Hugging Face, most people don't know the lore about this, but this is all straight from Hugging Face. Like CEO, I asked him years ago why they were called Hugging Face. They started as an attempt to create chatbots for mental health back in 2017, and they realized they'd built a lot of really good tech for running running LMs at that point, or embeddings models, I guess, like GPT-2. Or I don't use the term LLM for GPT-2. Right? Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
But they built all that tech, early transformer library, and they realized, okay, let's pivot to being the GitHub of AI, which they are now. And so I'm fascinated at how many companies start as very different and then pivot, often
Yeah.
early in their history, into something else.
Yeah. I mean, I think you have to be open-minded if you're, you start. I mean, there's always going to be, the visionary who has it all figured out right from the start, and you're going to go, I mean, guess like the Steve Jobs approach, right? You kind of come and you go on the stage and you have it all the answers, but not every person's going to have that type of path where you have that. So I do think you're, got to be a little fungible, flexible on what's presented to you and what looks to be the best path forward. And that's been the story of TextAI to some extent. I've evolved and pivoted with all of those changes I mentioned earlier too.
I hate Steve Jobs. No, like, what?
He was famously very mean to a lot of employees.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
treat
yeah.
Well,
very
if you read the books about it, but yeah, I mean, I wasn't really wanted to go too much into that, but just more of just that was the style a lot of people look at of like, the visionary that, I think a lot of, you can make an argument on a lot of the big tech visionaries, not, they're controversial. I wouldn't want to go into the details, but I do think that, I think that in general, I would say the vast majority of people don't have that experience. Most people are going to have, they're working on something, or whether they're working on a job, they're working on a company, they're working on volunteer research, whatever it happens to be. And then, one thing leads to another, and then boom, you're at this spot. There's also, Hollywood lives off of that, right? How did I get to this point in my life kind of stuff.
There was, I don't know, like a time few years ago that all the CEOs of startups, there were this slide that like, be like Apple, be like Steve Jobs, like, because, right, like we are not doing like the 99% we are not aiming to 99% quality. We need to work hard to get the 100% that everyone will know that we are the best. Thing like that.
No, I
I
understand.
think Steve Jobs was one of the main people that bring this I don't know, arrogant and attitude that we know better than you, and like we have all the information and just listen to us. And he
well, and
also was a bester.
but then there's the Woz, right? Steve Wozniak has, among people like us, a very positive reputation, right?
Yeah.
As the real technical mind behind Apple.
I think some people would say, look at myself, right? I mean, when technical people maybe are left, I'm a one-person company, when left to their own devices, maybe they go and they build an open source library and they give away a lot of their work for free, and they give a lot of their time away for free, and they kind of, spend some time on consulting to do what they think is best. But then you kind of ask, does someone like myself need a person to kind of push you in a direction? Because we go back to the original point. You were not to mean to pry, but how's this new ML thing going, right? Yeah. So I do think that you want to be a good person, and you want to do the open source and build in the right way. But then there's that other aspect of like, are you being true to yourself, and are you being smart with how you're approaching it? So I do think while, there's different personality types, that in some ways there's, some people need that spark sometimes, and that, I'm not saying you shouldn't be historically, mean to people, but I do think, there's that aspect of, in order to get, and there's a whole, I'm not an expert in this field, but in, management and motivational, like how do you get people to do things that you need them to do? Like what are the styles to be able to do that? And even in sport, like I said, I'm big in sports. You look at coaching, you got the coaches that are mean, like the disciplinarian coach, you got the nice guy coach, the player friendly coach. And for some players, the player friendly coach, they walk all over them. And for some players, they need the disciplinarian. So that's a whole very complex topic of how, like, human motivation, how do managers actually, what's the best style? And that to me is more of like a, maybe the people who worked at Apple liked that, needed that. I don't know. It's hard to say. I can't.
Yeah, I think it's not only related to I don't know, to the managers. Like for example, there is all the recent discussion about papers, right? Like if all the companies now, like the direction is to publish less and less papers, right? And there is a lot of discussion if it's good, if it's bad, like do we want to go there, like what to do in order to prevent it, right? Like a lot of the innovation came from papers in the recent years. And there was I will not say who, but like there was a Twitter that someone posted on Twitter about that, like about researchers, young researchers that are very like it's very good for them, like to reach out senior people and like to see like what they have published before, and then to reach them out and like to try to get into ML based on these publications and try to mimic them. Then he said something like, "Oh yeah, unfortunately there is less and less research, like open source research, and people publish less and less." And he just ignored that he's like very senior in these companies, like, and this company like is completely closed and like never published any papers that, and never published what they are doing. So I think that they have a lot of like how to say it, like things that are a bit. On one hand, you want publications, and you want that the people will publish their work, and the field will get progress. But from other end, you don't want to publish your own work, and you want that people will publish their own work, and not what you're doing.
Yeah.
So it's a conflict, and because there is so much money involved in it, it's become even worse.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of relevant to open source too. I mean, for someone like myself who has their own consultant work, right? And you have your own open source work, and where do you divide that line? So I publish a lot of things on what I do, obviously. I have more than the vast majority of humanity, I would say, of my time I've spent in actually sitting there and building stuff, quote unquote, for free, put it on GitHub. And I've done that, and I've adopted that. But also sometimes there's certain things I just publish a model, and maybe I don't put the training script out there. Someone's like, "Hey, could you just give me all the answers?" And it's just like, all right, well, at some point, where do you draw the line to say, well, this is, what I'm doing, and this is like, if I'm a company, or if I'm something that I'm trying to make a living off of, like, how much do you give away for free? And how much do you say is, and some people are 100% for free. And some people are 100% proprietary, never release anything. And you hear those stories of, I've read stories about like companies that are very closed mind, maybe they're in a very regulated space or in finance, and they're scared of sharing anything. And people come after them for committing back a simple change to an open source library. Like, no, you did that on our time. I'd like to think most people could be reasonable with open source. Like if there's a company out there that's, let's say TextAI, if someone's using TextAI and they pull it into their proprietary world, and then there's a bug and they fix it, I would like to at least think that someone would go and do a PR and say, "Hey, I noticed this," and fix it. But surprisingly, a lot of that doesn't happen. Someone pulls it down into their space, and I think back to before I really got into open source, how many libraries did I go and just install without knowing? I mean, I didn't know the story of every library or care. I was like, I'm just trying to solve a problem. So I do think that kind of related to what you were saying with how much do you, it's a struggle. How much do you publish and how much do you not publish? And where do you stand on how open you are? And you see it with, you read the stories, it sounds like Meta is moving away from, like Llama was open, and it sounds like maybe it will be more closed. I don't know if that's true or not, but like some companies are, it's a struggle. Like how much do you put into open source, and at what cost? And then there's obviously, if you're, depending on where you're located in the world, I think that there's some places are more, open source friendly and some aren't. So it's a struggle. I think that I don't think that there's a right answer, because at some point, if you just publish everything and you give away all your answers all the time, it's great for research. But if you're a company, at some point you're expected to make money, so you can't just give everywhere for free. So it's a struggle. But yeah, you should at least be some sort of way to contribute to, if you're benefiting. I would like to think like to take a penny, leave a penny. If you've ever seen one of those trays, like if you're always taking a penny and never leaving a penny, you're not really a good steward of the space either. You should at least somehow find some way within your capability to give back, because I'm very confident there's no person in technology that hasn't benefited from open source or open research,
And
also,
with, oh, you go, Ravid, sorry.
but so also, like, there is this thing that, like, if someone actually can take your library and implement everything and embed everything in their products, or like in their use case, so probably like you're not the right people that they actually need, right? Like, I think, and you need to help people that actually need your help, right? And this is something that, like, I'm curious. So what you think about it? Like, how you manage it? Like, what is the pipeline of a project from your perspective?
Right. Yeah. I think that I'm totally fine with a TextAI user who just downloads it and uses it. They have developers. They don't need me. I think the ideal user is someone who maybe has used TextAI or has an interest in AI space, and they look at me as someone they could, bring in to help them in some capacity, whether it's development or communicating or talking. So I do think that I'm not saying that, I want to have 100% of the TextAI users being people who work with me. It's unrealistic. And I think that once you put your product out there and it's open, you just have to be fine with the fact that the vast majority of people you're never going to even know about. I think I went through a while where I was pretty open on this with LinkedIn, but I just kind of moved on. But I felt pretty strong that I don't have any sort of metric. I don't have any sort of data collection from TextAI. A lot of open source projects have, uh, our phone at home with how you use it. I won't name names, and I wish I did. I just felt like that. A lot of people don't know that you install an open source library, and it's doing all sorts of stuff, sending back, anonymous metrics, right? What is really anonymous nowadays? If you IP addresses aren't really anonymous. I mean, I felt it would be a gold mine for me. It would be awesome if I went to TextAI and I put in some sort of capability where I was measuring how are people using it, what are people doing, what are the types of you know ways people are what components. I have all sorts of modules. I got RAG, I got LLM, I got embeddings. It would be super valuable data to me to be able to know that, but I made a decision early on that I didn't believe in that type of you know monitoring or anonymous data collection of users. I would say it's more the norm for most of the libraries that a lot of us know and love. Unfortunately, they have to do that for you know a variety of reasons.
So, related to that, one of the reasons that I've been so happy to work with you, even for that little bit of time, and followed your work and contacted you back in the day, is you always seemed to care a lot about like humanity and working in the healthcare space quite a bit, as you've mentioned, donating a huge amount of your time towards building this free and open source project. And I've always gotten the feeling from you that even with your stubbornness, as you call it, right, that you are deeply philosophically and ethically thinking about your decisions. And even I've always felt that, I'm sure, if we'd spent more time talking about things like personal belief systems, that it would be very similar, especially on things around, intellectual property, privacy, and pretty much all these other cyber issues. So I guess what I'm curious, David, is how much do you see the politics or philosophy or ethics in your project, and how you've kind of guided the development of it?
Sure. I mean, I think that, you go back to the 2022 range, and I think, at the time I was looking, Chat GPT, I'm like, hey, if we just turn over and we just call LLM APIs, what do we lose? We lose the ability to have control over that. And I'm just thinking, like, 50 steps in the future, if no one's building models anymore, I think I saw the writing on the wall what AI was going to become and how important these systems would be if there wasn't at least a way for someone to come and say, hey, I want my own version of this. I don't like what OpenAI is doing, or I don't like what Claude's doing. I wanted to do it my own way for a variety of reasons, not even, from an ethical standpoint, just from an operational standpoint. And this comes, I think, I've been around long enough to remember the pre-Linux days. So I think that is also a piece of it. I remember, if you wanted to be a developer, you had to pay Microsoft, to get a developer license, pretty much. That was like, a lot of people don't even know this world existed, the pre-Linux world, but I remember when I was in college and there was no free version of Visual Studio. You had to pay, and it didn't matter if you were a college student. And I remember that back when, I was one of the earlier people to be like, I'm going to make, the professors they were fine with it, but I was like, you know what? I want to run GCC and G++. I don't really want to do Visual Studio. It's not my thing. So I think that's where that was instilled from. I was building Linux from scratch. Like, I always had an interest in free and open source, and not because, that people don't deserve to make money. I'm not saying that, but it's just, for me, I wanted to be able to have control over my ability to develop. I didn't really like the concept of, needing permission. So I look at all these decisions in that same vein. Like, I looked at LM APIs as like, hey, you need permission. And I think we have a lot of, important concepts that have to determine with LLMs and like, the whole AI regulation space. But when we go down that space and then you kind of look at it, if it's centralized with, um, a few different companies, to me, I see that as a risk, because then what about if they go in a direction that you don't want? And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, no one builds LLMs anymore. You can't do that. You have to call one of these 5 URLs and that's it. So I think a lot of everything you just mentioned earlier is kind of been driven by, having, if you're a developer, and I'm thinking about the young, 16 to 20-year-old person, late high school and college, and maybe they don't have a ton of resources available. You even think about LLMs. If that kid isn't able to go and buy a cheap GPU and train his own things to learn, and he has to get a subscription to OpenAI, and that's the only way he learns, and it could be cost prohibitive, and you might lock out people. And some people might not understand it. Like, hey, I work at a big company. They don't care about $1,000, but for some people, $1,000 isn't readily available. So then you kind of lose those people, and they might be a genius someday in the future. So I think about those types of things, and I look at TextAI as something that someone can easily just go and download and use and learn. I've always tried to make it something that's easy to use, so that someone that wants to get started in the space can do that. And I think that there's things like coming up that are in similar vein. I look at open code and it seems to be a fairly compatible with my kind of viewpoint of the world. So that's why, I just recently released a new TextAI release with support to pretty much make open code look like an LLM to it, so that you can integrate open code as a OpenAI endpoint and actually add that into a potential process. Be interesting to see future integrations with that. But I've always kind of tried to stay true to those things. I do think there's a lot of other projects that are even claimed to open source don't really contribute. TextAI has a new ML. I mean, myself, I've published 60 plus models on Hugging Face Hub. If you go and you look at the projects that are similar to TextAI, the ones I mentioned, how many models do they have on Hugging Face Hub? So I look at that and I say, it's great, but they're doing they're doing their thing, right? It's not about necessarily the same thing that I'm doing. I think I've tried to be pretty good steward of the space, but I don't, I understand you get, and that's why I've resisted to some extent, bringing in investors, because I know that puts you in a certain direction.
So, the models, by the way, that you've contributed, have been often, I believe, pre-trained knowledge bases or embeddings, right? So you don't have to re-embed, but just have it all.
Exactly.
And that's really rare, actually, to contribute.
Well,
But
the PubMed BERT model is probably the biggest one. That's got over 100,000 downloads a month, and that is just, it's pretty. It's always one of the more popular ones. So
Maybe
yeah,
tell to the audience what it's doing.
what PubMed BERT's doing? Yeah, so it's not all ideas have to be like super complex. So all PubMed BERT is it's a sample of PubMed literature, and the PubMed BERT or BioMed BERT, I think they renamed it to, is a model that was pre-trained on medical literature. If if you're not familiar with PubMed, it's just a very large repository of abstracts across, pretty much all of the medical space, and you can download it. And
Is it only the
Microsoft.
abstracts?
There's also there's full text as well, but not for all the articles. It really depends if it's open access or not. Most articles, a lot of surprisingly, I think in the post, one thing that came out of COVID-19 and coronavirus, I think, is more and more open access research for medical was kind of unheard of before that. And I think that anything related to coronavirus was pretty much deemed open access. So that whole project I worked on, I think, was fueled by that. But I think once that has kind of went away, open access has been more and more popular. But it's still pretty, maybe 30% is open access, and 70% have only abstracts. But Microsoft actually trained that PubMed BERT, which has been renamed to BioMed BERT. It's a trained from scratch medical model, and I took a random sample of 100,000, 500,000 articles and trained an embeddings model on it. And at the time, this was 2023. I didn't really think much of it. I just did it and uploaded it to Hugging Face Hub and thought, it's just something to contribute. And you can make the argument it's the most used thing that I've ever built. It's just like I probably did it in like a day. It wasn't a pretty easy thing to do. I downloaded a couple of the abstracts, randomly sampled it, trained the model, and that's it. And so I've also trained similar models, a little more complex lately. At the end of last year, I trained a micro PubMed, Biomed model. So I took all the PubMed abstracts and then trained a series of, what was that, 240,000 parameters, 480 and 960. So it sounds like kind of a little nutty. It's like, who builds a model with 960 parameters? But it's actually surprisingly useful, and especially when you pair it with like late interaction. I found that for whatever reason, that late interaction models with really tiny models, it, it's produces, you can actually produce decent vectors, and you could do multi-vector search almost close. I think some of the stats I published almost close to like all mini LM level. So why would someone want to do that? Why do you care? Other than it just being academic of an exercise, it was more thinking for edge compute. I've always had, and kind of back to that basis in electrical and computer engineering. It's like, could you put some of these models on not just phones, but even smaller devices, potentially microcontrollers, like a powerful microcontroller? Could you run a 240,000 parameter? And I think the answer is yes.
So I love that you have this background in electrical, and even love things like assembly programming. I recently have gotten into retro computing, mostly in the context of vector computing. I'm obsessed with like the bright displays and the aesthetics, and got my own Vectrex. And with my Vectrex, which is a 1980s vector game console, I'm trying to learn how to program for it. And let me tell you, my TI-83 graphing calculator has 3 times the performance of the 1 megahertz processor in that Vectrex. But it's been an absolute trip going and learning how people coded back in the 80s,
Oh yeah.
in an era before GoTo considered harmful was implemented, and we got, if and else and for being the primary way to do control flow. So I'm just curious as to kind of what your background has been in working with like those microcontrollers, and do you think that there's any interest in trying to do some kind of retro related? I don't know what it'd
Sure.
look like retro computing with
Retro
LLM.
TextAI,
Yeah.
retro LM. Yeah, I do think that. Well, look at DeepSeek. When people say, "Hey, this is just academic," I mean, DeepSeek was able to do a lot by, with limited resources. I feel like a lot of people that are working at large organizations get spoiled with the fact that they have, ample resources. But I feel like humanity in general does the best when they're forced to work with limited resources. So I do think that I think it's a valuable skill set to have, to be willing to work in very constrained environments. I think some of the hardest problems are constrained. You're not always going to have, I think Rabbit brought it up earlier of, why use text AI? Why not just call one of those, API services? And, that's one way to look at it. But, behind the wall of that API service is a lot of complex engineering. So someone has to do the complexity, whether it's you or the other side. And I think, you look at a large company like OpenAI, and this is getting into like that old Six Sigma style management. If someone could go and shave off like, 50 microcents off of every product you're built, you end up saving, billions of dollars. Like, so having that mindset of being able to be efficient, if you're working on anything of scale, it leads to a lot of savings. If you can just save, 3 output tokens on your model, for example, it's just, you see people who are doing that. Like, I think OpenAI eventually at one point published that they were spending a ton of money on like hello and thank you, like from the responses. And they're like, all right, if we just were to cut these things out, we would all of a sudden save all this money in compute. So when you're doing things at a massive scale, I think you have to have a mindset of, quote unquote retro, and being able to operate at small things. So you do wonder, in this age of AI and people that are in school now and university and thinking, like, if you lose that mindset and you say, oh, well, AI is just going to do everything, there's no reason to have any critical thinking. Um, you know, I feel like we'd lose some things. And kind of the point you said earlier of, sometimes society goes backwards.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
yeah, I mean,
and
yeah.
are you concerned then about cognitive atrophy even in yourself, as you and I guess everyone else starts using Claude Code for everything?
I mean, I haven't really I haven't fully let go yet. So I think, but yeah, I mean, I think that I've used it more and more, and I think that I'm integrating it more and more. And you do wonder, when I look at some of those, I've always looked at it. It's like most tasks, I imagine myself like, hey, what it just did, what would I've had to do this? And it's like, all right, would I had to run, 100 Google searches and take this and take that and modify this and then, so you fast forward through a lot of things I don't necessarily want to do. I don't particularly like fighting through syntax errors. I don't know about you guys, but sometimes it's pretty annoying when it's just like, why won't this thing just work? It's not like I get personal joy out of that. So if there's a tool that could make me not have to do that, I'm kind of interested in that. I don't really, so in some ways you wonder, like, what are people scared of with some of this? Because no one's like sitting there and you're in Visual Studio Code or whatever, and it's giving you like, why won't this just work? I want to move on to like what I really care about. So it does seem like uh, we might not atrophy in that aspect if people use it that way, but I think it's more about a framing of it. I do think that the framing right now is developers are going away. You don't need developers. But I think the important thing is you need someone needs to come up with the idea. I do think that people need to have critical thinking, and if it's fast forwarding through 100 Google searches, or it's fast forwarding through syntax errors or a lack of understanding of a certain domain or space, to me that's a win. I don't see how you should be scared of that.
I agree. I think, but the main question is like, okay, so people that already work with code, they have this understanding, what does it mean, how it works, right? Like, so they can ask, I don't know, Cloud Code to do something like that, right? Or like if something gets wrong, then it can, like, you can guide it to the right direction. But for more junior people, now that they, I don't know, never build something like that, it can be more problematic, right? Because let's assume that you can come up with an idea, like a very high level idea, but now can you guide the cloud code to the right direction? Do you have this, I don't know, intuition what can get wrong or like where we should go? I think this is the open question, and I'm not sure if there is a good answer for it.
Oh, I think that's true. I mean, I think about an expert using, and I use more open code. If you've listened to why I would use open code over cloud code, it should be pretty obvious by now. Obviously, I'm a big believer. So when I've given those two options, I'm like, hey, I'm investing in the open code road. So I mean, I know it's probably in some cases not as capable as Claude, but just for the state of argument, it's like I was working on something and I was trying to get it to update. I was working on that TextAI paper and I was trying to update the LaTeX document. I'm not a big LaTeX expert. I'm not writing papers, so it's a perfect use case for me. I was like, I don't know the syntax and I don't really care. Don't really want to learn this piece. So it'd be nice if someone automated that. But there was some extra curly brace, and I went through like 5 loops saying, all right, I'm going to remove it. Now I'm going to try this way. Oh, I'm going to try this way. And I'm like, oh, for the love of God, will you just remove that curly brace? I'm just going to do it. And I opened the file and I removed it. And I said, forget what you know and just work on the next thing. So, but you think about someone who doesn't have a basic idea of coding syntax, and what are they going to sit there for like, eternity while it just like spins its wheels trying to figure out like something how to do. And even in that task, as I've worked on that paper and I didn't have really a great understanding of LaTeX, as time and time went on, I found myself more and more just editing the file myself as I kind of figured out what I was doing, because I was like, I just don't feel like waiting for this thing to do what I know how to do. So for something like TextAI, or I'm pretty well versed on Python, it's hard for me to imagine automating that when if it could do it fast. My bar is if it could do it faster than me and more accurate, I'm all for it. If it's not going to be smart, then I'm not interested. But not everyone has that luxury. So you think about someone who doesn't have the skill set, and they're just going to be at the mercy of Claude Code or Open Code to hopefully do the right thing eventually. And you could have that dialogue forever. No, I don't like this color. You're absolutely correct. I'm wrong. I picked the wrong color. I'll put this one, but you're still wrong. And I don't know if I feel like everyone's been in one of those loops with one of these tools at this point where it's just like, oh man, why do I bother? It's just like, it sounds like it's going to be good, but you get in some of those, and I'm fortunate, and I think people who have the coding expertise know when to use the tool, and maybe when where you're just like, all right, I'm just going to do it myself, and you fix it. But for the people who don't have that ability, or even the ability to notice the error, not all errors are going to resolve in a compile error or a runtime error. Even it might just be a hidden bug. If there's no way for you to have the ability to review what's being generated, I do think that, the quote unquote AI slop that everyone says is becoming a thing. And you hear these like, PRs being generated by, people who are just trying to contribute, but maybe don't have, a super amount of expertise. You do put a lot of strain on the other people who have to look at the output.
But even I don't know. I think like at the end, like the process will change, right? Like because even if you know what you're doing, and you let cloud code to making PRs, right? It will not be the same PRs as you will write. So like you probably have much more. There will be much more detail, like whatever. But
Mhm.
the process of people that review it, if there will be people that review it, like will have to change, right? Like you need to make it kind of like automated, and like you need to see how you are like understanding the high level details and still keep that they will not like keep the bugs and to fix all the things that you need to fix. So I'm not sure what, but something you will need to change.
Yeah. I mean, isn't it somewhat similar to, say, you're a software engineer or a manager of a software engineering team? Say you got 20 people working with you, and you're the manager, and you also review, your job is to review the product is being generated correctly, right? And so you have 20 developers working for you, and they submit PRs, and you're the only one who can merge it in. And you could just click the merge button if you're lazy and you don't feel like looking at it, and you could, or you're gonna, review it. At some point, if you look at the person, and if it's like one of your core key contributors, when they submit a PR, you generally are like, all right, Bill always does a pretty good job, so I'm gonna kind of just make a quick check. And maybe there's someone who just started on your team yesterday. You're like, all right, well, we're gonna go into the deep dive, and because I don't really trust that person, but wouldn't you say the argument could be once AI doesn't make a mistake, don't people then eventually say, all right, well, this is always right, so there's no reason to review it anymore? Is that what eventually happened? Because in this, in most people, I think that's what people would want. Most people want it to get to a point where I don't want to look at it. No one really wants to review code. I don't think that anyone likes reviewing code, and whether it's human generated or AI generated. And I've been in that seat myself, where you're running a team and people submit things, and there's a part of you that just wants to click the button and it says merge. I just don't want to look at it. But the other voice says, no, I guess I have to do it. It's part of my job, because then the outcome. If you don't look at it, it's deployed to production, something breaks, and then you're part of the problem.
But what you're doing in this case is like the LLM generate tons of code, right? That it may be fine, it may be not, but who knows? And like let's assume that you already like did really good job in the past, but still it's not like now someone submit one PR like with I don't know 3 files that you change some lines here and there that you can go over it, right? Even if you really want to. What you're doing in this case, you just say, okay, probably it's good enough. Let's push it to product and hope for the best.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's
Maybe.
blind to faith is the answer at some point. Is that you just hope, and maybe it's right 99% of the time, and it's not worth looking at it except when it breaks and it flows through and flows back to you and is a bug. And then you just probably submit to Claude Code to say, hey, this is the error, fix it. And it's like, oh, okay, I'll fix this. I do think that it'll be interesting to see how much autonomy we give, and then there's the whole open question of, well, what do people do? I mean, what's the human in the loop? Is the human in the loop eventually none, or is there always a human in the loop? And it really depends. I think that depending on the business area, like we I
So,
think we've long had I think we've long had the ability where, in theory, a plane could be pilotless, but we always have a pilot. How would you feel? You step on the plane, you look, it's like, hey, this is the AI powered plane today. There's no pilot. Like, would you feel good about that, or would it be a part of you like, you know what? I'd like a person just in case something went wrong. But wouldn't you say that about most parts of, this, how long, and even with self-driving cars, which is less of a risk because you figure, what's the worst thing? As long as you're not driving really fast. Like if you're just driving through city streets, you're not too scared. But, would you go on a plane that's, and if you read about the way planes operate, I mean, the vast majority of time they're autopilot. And some people think that that's safer than a human because humans make errors and that doesn't. But there's always a part of you that would like to see a pilot sitting there, right? At least for me. I don't know if I'd ever want to go on a plane that I look and there's no like door because it's like it's a machine back there and that's it. You know?
Well, I do worry about, I mean, the time period in between us getting a chess engine that could beat the best human, Deep Blue, and then getting a chess engine that, while unassisted, can beat the same chess engine while assisted by the best grandmaster. Wasn't that long. It was like, depending on how you count, like 5 to 9 years, right? And
Yeah.
now we have, chess engines in our pocket that can destroy Magnus Carlsen, with like penalties applied, with how good they are, right? And with that in mind, I'm a little scared, honestly, that humans will not be able to retain a long-term position as like puppet master or as agent steward.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I have kids myself, so I have a kid that's getting close to college age, and you wonder like what do you recommend? Like if, where would you guide your kid? Because I think a lot of parents do tend to guide their children towards their future career. So would you say go get a computer science degree? Is that a good idea? Some would say no. Some people remember, 20 years ago it was the trade jobs were going to be replaced, and now you see people saying, "Man, maybe going in and getting learning a trade is a better option than going and getting a standard bachelor's degree." I don't know. It's a super important question. I don't really have the answers to. I would like to think that having a computer science background would still be beneficial to society. That I don't think it would be good for us to just pretty much totally devalue that profession and not have people go into that space, because then eventually, we would revert because someone has to build these models. And I guess someone would make the argument, well, eventually, we get AGI and they'll just completely replace us and they'll just keep improving themselves. But is that good? I don't know. So it is like a challenge, like, and what isn't automatable? Because for those people who say, oh, trade jobs are safe. I mean, have you seen some of the robots that are coming out these days? Like, have you been watching that space? Like, for long, I don't know if you're familiar with like Boston Robotics and some of the robots they build, but, stuff that's happening over, in other parts of the world outside of the United States, you'd be, it's like, hey, how far is that along? Is that necessarily safe? I don't really know if there's anything that's AI safe, if you will. I feel like that everything is kind of on a path to automation, but I just don't know, is it full automation or is it human in the loop? And how, like to that point of the pilot story, how long do we as people have to sit there and need the person there, even if they don't do anything? I don't know how much a pilot does now. And I know it's quite automated. I know that for sure. I'm not a pilot though, so I couldn't tell you how much of it is automated, but I know that there's a good deal that you don't have to be there, but we like having them there because it's, you feel good to have a person that's keeping your company. Let's pick a financial company that does automated trading. Do you feel comfortable having someone around in case they need to pull the switch and say, no, it's going bad? I just feel like that, if anything, there will be a long period of time where people that have these expertise, even if they've been fully automated out, they'll still have maybe not as many, but there'll still be a role for them. At least it might be boring. And you read the people who publishing about their lives of developing code with Cloud Code and Open Code, and they're like, you know what? I don't really like doing this anymore. All I do is read whatever the code the LM generates. It's actually quite unfulfilling. So as people get automated out and you feel like you're not adding value, do people move away to other things? So I feel like for most people, it's two reasons: you get a job, or one, you have to provide for yourself, and then two, you'd like to add value, right? So if you're doing something and you don't add value, that would be be interesting. Those are like big questions, though. I don't know. We'll see.
Well, I think we're getting near the end of our recording, so I think I'd just like to ask you if you have any like final thoughts or anything that you want to like tell the audience, or a pitch, or something.
Well, I appreciate you guys giving me the opportunity. I do think, um, obviously TextAI, if that's something, if you're looking for a library in the AI orchestration space, even if it's through open code or cloud code, you could certainly say it does work quite well in those aspects. I think it might work better. It's a very minimalistic framework. Might be, I don't have quite, I feel like it has generally positive reviews. There's no real text AI hate club, unlike for some other similar framework, but I also don't have the same. I don't have the same level of adoption. I'm pretty sure if I had, you know, 1,000,000 stars, that there would be some level of people who don't. Because as the more and more people you have it, the more and more it's natural. Regardless, I do think that it's generally a well-received framework. If you're like a minimalist framework, it's something that you should definitely take a look at. And as you said earlier, NumL, work around that. So if there's ever someone who needs help with the types of things you're doing with TextAI, feel free to reach out.
Great. It's always a pleasure to have brilliant minds like yourself on our podcast. And it's always a pleasure to be able to share space with Ravid as well. So thank you for coming on, David.
Thank you, Alan.
I appreciate you guys' time. It's been fun.
All right. Well,